I put the slides on Robert's. Robert has a file share. From his perspective, it's a file share, right? From your perspective, it's a website. And the link is posted in the about part of the YouTube channel where all these videos are. So if you want the overhead, if you want the slides that we use for any of this stuff, have at it, you can download them. I change them all the time, like I did this morning. So I'll put the date on it. Like today, I put whatever it was, 11/26. Yesterday, it's already changed. So it's just the way it is. Keep changing my mind. But at any rate, we've just kind of, well, to say we finished chapter 1 is arrogant. It's going to keep going. We introduced a bunch of things about righteousness and the gospel and Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles and so forth. We're going to come back and revisit that, of course, because he's introducing a whole bunch of stuff that he's going to continue to address for the rest of the book as he weaves his points together to form this masterpiece. Dialogue with his whatever kind of adversary, Jewish adversary or somebody here in the early chapters. That's a moo way of viewing it, but I think I agree with it. Doesn't really matter. At any rate, we got to clean up a loose end here. We had a careless discussion, careless on my part, about Ephesians chapter 2:8. So let's go back and clean it up a little bit. So here it is. Ephesians 2:8. By grace you have been saved through faith. Right here. It's one of the times when grammar matters and construction of words matters. Where's it? That. It's not a that, it's a this, isn't it, Kathy? Doesn't matter. So you have a demonstrative pronoun. You have a demonstrative pronoun that's modifying a noun before it. And in Greek, it's case. It's case. So I'm sorry, gender. It's both case number and gender. So you have nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative cases. And you have masculine, feminine, and neuter genders. Don't think in terms of human gender, but just ways of understanding words, the grammar of words. And the rule is that demonstrative pronouns, like any other pronoun or adjectives, they take the same case, number, and gender as the noun which they're modifying. That's how you know what goes with what. And that's why it doesn't matter whether stuff comes before or after something. In this case, it's interesting. Grace and faith are feminine words, feminine nouns, and saved is a masculine participle. So a participle is in English, it's kind of an ing form of a word. But by grace you have been saved. Is that an aorist? Sorry, I should have done this before. It's a perfect, right? Isn't that right? That's a perfect, right? Seth's in front. At any rate, it's for by grace you are being saved, or something. You are having been saved, or something like that. It's an ing form of the word, but it's masculine. So you have a neuter demonstrative pronoun modifying something, but the thing that it's supposed to be modifying is either feminine or masculine. And it's a very deliberate thing that Paul did. He should have, properly speaking, the pronoun should be masculine or feminine. If it was masculine, you could say, oh, then it's the this that it's referring to, or that is the saved. If it's feminine, well, it's either the grace or the faith. So it would be the salvation is not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. If the pronoun was masculine, or it'd be the grace or faith is not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. If it was feminine, he didn't do either one of those. He chose neuter. So then the debate becomes, why did he choose neuter for this thing? And the answer, in my view, is he's referring to the whole thing. This whole phenomenon, this whole magnificent phenomenon of having been saved by grace through faith. This is that thing is not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. So that squares with what we were talking about last week, that the faith that you have is yours, even though it's enabled by him, and it would not be there otherwise. The grace is his, and the act of saving is his as well. You are the one saved, but he is the one doing the saving. All of that together, that phenomenon is of him and not of you. Something like that. Very, what's the word? Much more contentious debate than I just presented it. If there was people with different theological outlooks in here, we would have already heard it by now. But at any rate, that cleans up the mess a little bit of Ephesians chapter 2. Do you two have any problem with anything I just said? Okay. All right. I should have looked at it on the spot. I knew I was missing something. Soteria. Soteria is a feminine word. It's a feminine noun, right? So he chose a participle. He chose a masculine form of the participle. Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Why did he choose the masculine form of the participle? Yeah, well, we don't care. We're not studying that book. Yeah. All right. Let's put all that behind us. Okay. Here we are in the end of Romans chapter 1. I'm going to go back to it because it's so fundamental to the point that Paul makes in Romans 1. You stand or fall in a very real sense on this foundational truth that is, in my view, the premise of all biblical revelation. Accept this premise and everything falls into place. Reject this premise about the Creator, and here we are in the world in which we live today. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's not just the first verse of the Bible. It is the foundational premise, in my view, of all of biblical revelation. And it is revisited time and time again. I've done a sermon in front of this church, although some people don't think I'm a preacher. I don't know what else to call it. Psalm 96. Here's the definitive distinction between God and gods. All the gods of the peoples are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. He is the only one. He is distinctive. He is unique by virtue of that. He can transmit love. We can have love. We can love. We can show mercy. We can understand the world around us. We can understand truth versus lie. So on. We can do a lot of things because we're made in the image of God. But one thing no human being ever has been, ever is right now, or ever will be, and that is the maker of the heavens and the earth. He reserves that exclusively, and by virtue of being the maker of the heavens and the earth, he reserves exclusively to himself the worship of his creatures. And to not acknowledge that is to arrive at the argument that he makes in Romans chapter 1. And it's ugly. The worship of that, they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Who is blessed forever? The Creator is blessed forever. He means God, of course, God Almighty, but he's thinking of the Jewish sense out of the great tradition about the blessedness, the supremacy, the authority of the one and only Creator. Okay. It's already 9:30. Let me get rid of this thing here. I went back. Let's do this quick. I went back and anybody remember this? This was from a summer that we did in 2019. How we got here to the mess that I thought existed in 2018, excuse me. I thought it was a mess in 2018. Wow. Yeah. So I ginned this up. These are period. This is an unfolding over time. Think of a timeline right here of going up through these arrows until we arrive at today with what I call a post-globalist loss of faith, which is to say a loss of faith in globalism itself. This whole idea of a new world order that people have talked about, that itself has become unraveled and has experienced a crisis. and not too soon for me. But at any rate, I was looking through, we talked about social justice and its religious component. And I was looking at the list of things that I identified in 2018. And it's interesting how some of it mirrors Romans 1, but also how it changes. I noticed that I updated it in 2019. Things are moving so fast. I updated it in 2019, and then in 2020, I had to add to it. And then I just did it again this morning, urban instability, which is fallout as well from a feral morality, which I talked about last week, having taken over the culture, and how much that is reflected in Romans chapter 1, which I described as a feral morality last week. Moral entropy, right? Entropy. Closed systems tend towards disorder. The amount of disorder in a system tends to increase unless work is done on the system to keep it or to reduce the entropy. And that's the way civilization is. And when you have, but a civilization is only as stable as its morality, that morality that underpins it. When your morality becomes feral, when moral entropy is introduced into the system, it's extremely difficult. You have to do a lot of work to maintain the order of the system. And you can no more reverse the moral entropy of a civilization than a dam can reverse the flow of the water that's building up behind it, until eventually the water breaks through, like it did to those two dams up in up north, Wixom and Sanford. I live downstream of the Sanford. My sister does too. The Sanford Dam. The Tittabawassee River is the outflow of that dam. Anyway, so moral fragmentation, moral entropy, the disorder increases, and eventually, as it has happened in our culture, that moral entropy now has a social and civil component. And that's why I put it in right here. The instability that we see is a natural outgrowth, is a component, is a physical component, a civil component of the moral entropy that has invaded our culture. And I believe the moral entropy is a product of nihilism. The nihilism that life, humanity, civilization is not headed towards any particular destination. And it leads to this loss of faith in all things, in everything, including immorality. And so now our morality is in contrast, it defines itself consciously in contrast to Christian morality. The sexual moray, and it's never more clearly reflected as the morality, the mores of a people is never the traditional morality and values that are accepted by a culture are never more clearly seen than in its sexual mores. And that's where we are. That's what we see right here. It's a leading indicator. It's a leading indicator. You can see it here twice. Sexual morality is a leading indicator of where the culture is headed. And that was true for the Roman Empire several hundred years later, and it will be true for us. Nobody can predict it. I'm not predicting anything, and I'm not saying anything about the way things ought to be. I'm not speaking in the subjunctive. I'm speaking in the indicative. This is empirical. It's pattern recognition. All you have to do is look around you, and it's as plain as it could possibly be. So some things never change. History never repeats itself, but it frequently rhymes. And we are rhyming right here. Pattern recognition. Okay, 9:37. Some things I was thinking about this week. Gary's 15 minutes on something that has nothing to do with what we're talking about in the Bible. Does anybody want to say anything about all that? It's off the top of my head. I can't blame anybody for what I just said, but it seems pretty obvious to me. This thing that's shaped up around us, just like it's interesting, again, rhyming with history. He's dealing in temple practices here. He will do so explicitly in 1 Corinthians 6, where he has to encourage these Christians to separate themselves from the practices of the temples in which they were involved. And part of that temple practice was sexual ritual. And so he gets into that. Do you agree with that, roughly? Okay. he goes on this rant in 1 Corinthians 6 on this subject. And if you knew something about the way that temples worked back then, you could entice these gods to do things, but you entice them to be fertile by mimicking a ritual in front of them. And so you can imagine what that ritual is. That's one way of thinking of it. And so it's interesting how our mores, particularly in regard to sexual behavior, have become pagan. Not that they're trying to entice anybody to do anything, but there it is. It's just staring you right in the face. The leading edge of something else. And we just don't know what that something else is going to be. And there's no way, sorry, Christians, there's no way to reverse it. You cannot reform that. There's no going backwards. There may be a way forward, but it won't be what was past. It'll be something else. Nobody ever recovers a pastime. That's why they call it a pastime. Okay. That's enough of that. Which takes us to chapter 2. This has an endpoint. It is often said that God's attributes are infinite, even though I really don't believe in infinity, and neither should you. But it's another subject that's beyond the scope of even the Bible. Holiness, love, God has infinite love, infinite mercy, and so forth. And we can carry that a little bit too far. I understand the idea, and I, in principle, agree with it. It's inexhaustible. What is not inexhaustible is his patience. His patience, he is patient and kind unto the fourth generation and blah, blah. But it's not infinite. His patience has an expiration date. His patience will come to an end. And when God's patience comes to an end, it gets really, really ugly, because that's when you see the wrath of God, which is already being poured out. Already. Anyway, we're going to get to precisely that. Not only is that true, that God's patience has an expiration date to it. He knows the date. None of us know the date. The date is carved in stone. We can't find the stone, so we don't know what that date is. But that expiration date for his patience is fundamental to the gospel, to the good news of Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is going to be the one who judges. And that's fundamental to the gospel. You're going to see it there at the end of the section, Romans chapter 2, verse 16, the day. So that's where he's pushing. He starts talking about the wrath of God being poured out, and he will, in a sense, close his rant. If you want to think of it, his moral rant about feral morality, with this statement in verse 16, when God's patience comes to an end. And it exactly coincides with the great day of the Lord that is laid out in the prophets. He's a good Jew. That's how he thinks. Okay. So he does his little rant, his great rant, one of the great rants against evil in the entire Bible, against what I'm calling moral entropy or feral morality. On a pagan world, maybe, and maybe a little bit more than that, on a pagan world out of control, most acutely embodied in its sexual practices. Then he does something a little bit surprising. This is what he says. Therefore, you are without excuse. Who is you? Every one of you, he says to this church, this Roman church of Gentiles that he's never met before. We're 32 verses in, and this is how he unloads it. Every one of you who passes judgment or judges, for in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself, for you who judge practice the same things. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. So look at that little phrase, practice such things, the practice of such things. Now it's indeterminate, but it's because it was determined before. Not only was it determined, he doesn't need to say anything, because here's the such things.
Well, what if you hadn't done those things?
That's what everybody's saying that he's writing to. I didn't do any of those things. Paul's point is precisely the opposite. He will push to the great conclusion in chapter 3. Yes, there is none righteous. And in case you want to exempt yourself, not even one, right? And then a little farther, the great statement, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's where he's headed. So he's in the middle of it at this point. So do we know what the such things are from which many, many people exempt themselves? And the judgment here that he's using the word krino, judge. It's all the same word. I've got it in blue, except for justified. I don't know why I put that in blue. But you can see how the idea changes. The blue, he goes from judgment. Uh-oh. Then he gets into the law. Look at all the green. Then he gets into circumcision. Look at all the red or whatever that is. Right? So you can, without even reading it, you can see where he's going with this. It starts out sort of generic, you who judge, and it's going to end with the circumcision. Those who are formally submitted to the Mosaic covenant or something like that. We talked about it all through Acts. Now you know why I talked about that. It's so fundamental to understanding biblical theology. We just want to make it be works in general, doing good, right? Can a person be good enough to go to heaven? Do you think you've been good enough to go to heaven? No, forget all the good enough. No works of Gentiles would have counted to a Jew who was submitted to the Mosaic covenant. It was the works of the law. It was the commandments and requirements handed down through the law that mattered. If you weren't doing that embodiment of God's morality, if you will, God's mores, then we don't even want to talk about it. You don't get any, there's, no substitute. There's no replacement for that. There's no good enough. Yeah, you don't have Moses, but it's close. Close enough for government work. None of that is Moses. So anyway, judge, judgment, judge, blah, blah. In the middle of it is condemn. You condemn yourself. The only difference between that word and this word is the compound word with a thing that, what's the word? Makes it more aggressive, katakrino. But you could replace that idea here. For you who condemn, for in that which you condemn yourself. For you who condemn, practice the same things. We know that the condemnation of God falls rightly upon those who practice such things. But do you suppose this, oh man, when you condemn those who practice such things, they do the same, so that you will escape the condemnation of God? It's exactly the same idea. So don't, I don't know how you feel about that, but that's what he's getting at. The judgment that he's talking about here is not any judgment where a person acquits. Oh, you've done right. I judge you as having done right. He's not talking about that. He's talking about people who condemn. And those people we're going to find out very shortly are Jews. For a very specific reason. We'll have to talk about that. You have no excuse. You are without excuse, every one of you who passes judgment. For in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. But do you suppose this, O man, when you pass judgment on those who practice such things? Third occurrence, practice such things. And do the same yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and tolerance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God is intended to lead you to repentance? Let me stop there for a second. So he unloaded on the world out there, and then he turns his focus on, these are all singular, the yous. Those are second person singular. That's a, I don't know, rhetorical style. He's not talking to any specific person in the Roman church. He's engaging in this. James does the same thing in the book of James, where you engage in this sort of, not imaginary, but mental dialogue, mental duel with a person on the other side. We call it the devil's advocate sometimes. Something like that is going on. He doesn't know these people. He's already commended them. Your faith is being proclaimed throughout the world. So that's not, they know what he's doing. It's a well-known Greek Hellenistic style of rhetoric. So it's interesting that James does it in the book of James, but that's what's going on. So they would be listening to this, learning what they can from him about what is he really trying to say, not feeling accused probably. Jewish presumption. He's dealing with the question of Jewish presumption, the presumption of Jews and Jewish tradition that they have obtained special favor from God by virtue of the fact of having received his oracles in the law, by virtue of the fact that they are children of Abraham. Simply, in a sense, simply by existing downstream from those great events, the covenant with Moses and the covenant with Abraham, simply by existing downstream from it, they believed that they have the presumption of God's special favor. And Paul is taking that on right straight like a Mack truck. Now remember that when he wrote this, where was he? When did this get written? Probably. We talked about this. Yeah, so that's a prevailing opinion. It's a guess, but so what he did was, where are we at? Mission, Paul, journey, third journey. So he got in trouble. What city did he get in trouble on his third journey? A lot of trouble. The Ephesus dang near started a riot over him. So he left Ephesus and he went to Macedonia and Achaia. Here's Corinth down here. It's Greece. And a lot of the prevailing opinion is that he wrote Romans. He was by then planning on going to Rome when he, as the pastor said, when he got back to Jerusalem. And so he wrote Romans in anticipation of going to Jerusalem and then immediately going to Rome on his way to Spain. He did go to Jerusalem and then to Rome, but not the way he thought he would. But at any rate, so he had just come off this near riot in Ephesus. Plus, he probably went to Philippi where they hated him. That's where he got in trouble with the slave girl. He cast out the demon in the slave girl, and the authorities beat him and put him and Silas in prison, even though they were both Romans. So he got in trouble there. We ran afoul of and it had to do with, she was their magical, she was the slave girl who was their meal ticket, because, she had these powers, so they thought. Then he's going to come down to Athens, where it's full of idols. And then he gets to Corinth, where it's full of idols. He was already in Ephesus, where it's full of idols. So he's just surrounded by this. He's just living he's swimming in a sea of idol worship and everything that goes with it in these temples. And so it's perfectly understandable. I mean, I would understand it if this was just kind of a cathartic experience as he's in the midst of it, because if he wrote it in Corinth, it's everywhere. And he's had enough of it. And as he's hot on the issue in the midst of the battle, at runtime, when he's doing this, he just can't take it anymore. And so he lets him have it. He lets the pagan world have it, perhaps. I don't know. But now it's time to move on to traditional Jews, who he also had a lot of trouble from getting run out of town. He got ran out of Thessalonica by Jews. He got ran out of Pisidian Antioch and Lystra by Jews. He had to leave the synagogue in Corinth. Got dragged before the proconsul of Achaia by Jews. That was the story of Jason, whose house was next to the synagogue. He converted the synagogue ruler, so all of this is swirling. So this is, it's amazing to me that in that kind of heat of the battle, you can collect yourself and produce this masterpiece. It really is extraordinary, and it speaks to the inspiration of the thing. So I don't know what I would have been doing, but I probably would have been hiding, trying to stay out of the way. Okay. So he's pushing towards universal condemnation in chapter 3, 9 through 18. Jewish presumption of God's special favor. I got it all in here. We will not see the word faith until 3:22. He used it in verse 17, and he won't use it again until 3:22. He's doing something else here. Contra faith. Any Jew would have agreed The judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things in verse 2. They just never would have thought that they were the ones who would practice, who would be caught in the net that Paul is casting. That they're worthy of death. That's verse 32. So he introduces the idea of the judgment. The wrath of God ends with death. And now he will point that charge against, it appears, Jews. The wrath of God that is already falling on Gentiles is also already falling on Jews. Because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. There's that word righteous again.
Isn't it sort of that he's saying, you guys sat by and thought all that in chapter 1 was, well, all the Gentiles, boy, they really deserve it. The truth is, it's doing too.
That's right. Yeah, it's we're heading towards the great statement right here in verse 11. Concluding statement on this argument. There is no partiality with God. In either his mercy, meaning his grace, or his wrath. No special favors for being downstream of the Mosaic covenant. A couple of my thoughts on this is pretty standard argument right here, but a couple of my thoughts on this. One is I'm wondering how much God-fearing Gentiles have to do with this. Who, at this level of the argument, you have these God-fearing Gentiles who were instructed by Jews in the synagogues a lot of the time. And how much did they inherit this self-flattering notion that once I'm under the umbrella of the covenant in its protective domain, the Mosaic covenant, then I'm okay. And I now get to look at because of this class-oriented society, right? Now I get to look at the rest of the pagan world, in a sense, from Jewish eyes, and with that same sense of preference or presumption of my own favor before God ahead of them. And I've wondered whether this is, Moo and others will say that this is the self-righteous man. And I'm kind of wondering whether it's the God-fearing Gentile that he has in mind, which he also would have seen. Got to untrain that too. If you're gonna make disciples, Christian disciples out of God-fearing Gentiles in synagogues, you have to undo some of what was done to them as part of the synagogue training. So that's one thing. Another thing is, I've talked before about spiritual stratification and social stratification. Probably should have hunted this down. Yeah, this is from the past, the sermons I've given in the past and teaching I've done. But you have a social caste system. I've reduced it down to two: the Roman at the top and the slave at the bottom. The Roman, from the slave, from the Roman point of view, you have a human and a non-human, virtually. And in the spiritual caste system, you have virtually the same thing. From Jewish eyes, defined genetically, Israelite. And from his point of view, that polytheistic pagan Gentile that Paul is talking about is hardly even human. You pick up on that when Peter didn't even want to walk into the house of a God-fearing Gentile in Acts chapter 10, 8 chapters after the day of Pentecost. You know how unlawful it is for a person who is a Jew to enter into the house of a Gentile, or even eat with him, or even sit with him, or something like that. I forget how he says it. But you get that same Jewish preference, Jewish favoritism from a man who had the Spirit poured out on him 8 chapters earlier. We don't know how many months or years that corresponded to, but at any rate, there it is: spiritual stratification. The tendency to stratify people and put them in groups, and you order those groups. We're getting there. Another parallel, history rhymes. We're getting there here in our time. But you put those groups not next to each other. We're not talking segregation. Implicit in segregation, of course, is often a hierarchy. But here it's explicit. There's a spiritual hierarchy that was in operation through the Jewish eyes. And the proselyte and the God-fearing Gentile would have picked up on that and seen themselves categorically distinct from polytheistic pagan Gentiles. I don't know whether any of that is true. but it sounds right. So that's going to come into the church. Else probably he wouldn't be talking about it. For example, First Corinthians, which is a book which is tackling head on the problems of spiritual and social stratification within the church. Okay, because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, those are terrible qualities to have. In verse 5, you are storing up wrath for yourself. This day of coming wrath that is implicit, that is native to the gospel, to the good news of Jesus Christ, contains within it this idea of the pouring out of wrath. Moose says it this way: a new era in salvation history has dawned in Christ. I add to it that there is great continuity between it and what has gone before. So if you look at these timelines that I make, we like to do this, right? The big white line right here at the birth of the Messiah tends to lead you to want to separate history into two distinct parts, implying radical discontinuity between what came before and what comes after. Do away with that line, get rid of that line. They did not think that way. So this new era of salvation history doesn't arrive with a line in it. It just modifies the old one, and it keeps right on going. And so you could understand the new era in fact, you could only understand the new era from the past. So as far as this, whatever you want to call it, judgment of Paul, ironically, almost like in a court where he's about to hand down sentence and he's leaning over the bench and explaining to the defendant why his condemnation is just. He's on pretty solid ground. Doesn't take long in Isaiah. He calls out all of creation to bear witness with him against his people. Sons I have reared and brought up, but they have revolted against me. An ox knows its master, a donkey its master's manger, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand. There is no one righteous, there is no one who understands, there is no one who does good. Paul will say that, echoing this. Alas, sinful nation, people weighed down with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who act corruptly. Really, what is the distinction between these people and the pagan idolaters that surrounded them? They have abandoned the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They have turned away from him. This should sound very familiar. He's not quoting this passage in Romans chapter 3, which is coming. There's none righteous, not even one. But the spirit of it just screams out at you. And then he talks about how much he's tried to, in his forbearance, bring them back, and it didn't work. Your land is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. Unless the Lord of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would have been like Sodom and Gomorrah. And he just calls them Sodom in Gomorrah. I don't care about your sacrifices. Oh, I'm not going to listen anymore. Repent. Right? Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from my sight, so on and so forth. I was going to want to do one at the end here. Here comes the judgment. I will be relieved of my adversaries. Doesn't he say, yeah, I will be relieved of my adversaries, and I can't wait. After having just condemned his own people, I will be relieved of my adversaries and avenge myself on my foes. I will turn my hand against you. Nasty, nasty, nasty. Then eventually you'll be called a city of righteousness. We'll leave aside. Strong man will become tinder, his work also a spark. Thus they will burn together. There will be none to quench them, the day of the Lord. Ouch.
And then into the bunch.
Him?
Yeah.
He's acting right out of the tradition. He's acting, this is classic Hellenistic diatribe. They understand exactly what he's doing. He's making a point, and he's using this style to do it. So he has no particular person in mind. It's an imaginary person who is a certain way. And so they're not thinking of it that he's judging anyone. He's acting in the tradition of the Hellenistic tradition of diatribe, in my opinion. And of course, he's echoing the prophets. So if you're a Jew and you're listening to it and you're offended, then you got to be offended at Isaiah. Because Isaiah is the one who said that, right? The vision of Isaiah. He's the one that came out of the wilderness or whatever. And this is what he said to the people right off the bat. It's the first thing he said. So I don't know. That doesn't really help, but you're right. He is judging. There's no question. He's judging an imaginary person, which is to say all of them, a whole world, really. Doing so through the eyes of God in the finest tradition of Isaiah. But you can do that sort of thing when you're an inspired writer. Did you want to say anything about that? Yeah, we can come back to it. We're still introing a little bit, even though we're in chapter 2 already. Luke chapter 3. John the Baptist in the finest tradition of Isaiah, who's already been quoted right here. That's Isaiah right there. Began saying to the crowds who were coming out to be baptized by you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come. He's talking to Israelites here. Do they run away? Are they offended and they run away to the authorities to do something about John because they're so incensed that he would say this? Bear fruits in keeping with repentance and do not begin to say to yourselves, here it is, we have Abraham for our father. That's not going to get you just because you live downstream. I don't care if you live in the downstream, you live downstream of Abraham and Moses. For I say to you that from these stones, God could raise up children to Abraham. Indeed, the axe is already, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath in Revelation. The axe is already laid at the root of the trees. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire without partiality. No Jewish preference. Don't even think that thought. He could make children of Abraham out of stones. So there is no partiality with God. Underpins this passage by John the Baptist. We could continue with Jesus. But so, from Isaiah to John, and now Paul is going to engage in the same kind of thing. So don't miss it. I think I pulled it out into a slide because it's poorly translated in my view. I can find what I'm looking for. Probably should have done this before. Yeah. Verse 120, chapter 1, verse 20, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. The invisible is visible, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. At the end of the chapter, although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only practice the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. That little phrase. Therefore, without excuse you are. You see what he started right here? In 120, in a sense, exactly backwards. It's pretty literal translation, exactly backwards. They are without excuse you are. Which we always, in English, makes more sense as there, you are without excuse, which is the way it's done. I don't know why they switched over and says you have no excuse. It's the same word. It's exactly the same thing. But anyway, so every man who judges for in what you judge another, you condemn yourself, for you who judge, practice the same. Practice such things, practice the same. Those who practice them, practice the same. Very, very obvious. That's why I like colors. It's just harsh. So the revelation of God's righteousness necessarily brings the great outpouring of his righteous wrath in the day of judgment, which is already, in some sense, being poured out. The axe is already laid at the trees. And when John said that, he was speaking to Jews. There were no Gentiles in sight. It's the kind of stuff that makes you shiver. You think about it too long, so you go get ice cream. And everything is better for a while. Who will render to each person, every man, literally, according to his deeds. So women, there's where you don't want the gender neutral. You want to go back to the men being the ones, right? Who will render to every man according to his deeds. To those who by perseverance in doing good seek for glory and honor and immortality, eternal life, that's their reward. But to those who are selfishly ambitious and do not obey the truth, hearkening back, always look for echoes. Suppress the truth. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. And now it's very similarly constructed. So do not obey the truth. He never tells us exactly what the truth is, but obey unrighteousness, just like in Romans 1:18. Wrath, Romans 1:18, and indignation. He's repeating himself. But he's repeating himself now in the context of not the pagan context of 1:18 through 32, but what is soon to become a Jewish context. That's how he's repeating himself now. It's virtually the same lecture, but now he's going to use a little different language and aim it at the same argument is going to aim at a different set of people. It appears to me. There will be tribulation and distress. Get rid of these words right here and it gets really harsh. Paul does this a lot. He doesn't have whole sentences. Tribulation and distress for every soul of man who does evil. He leaves out this part right here. They supply it because in English you need it. Of the Jew first, and also of the Greek, but glory and honor and peace to everyone who does good without distinction, to the Jew first, but also to the Greek, for there is no partiality with God. So in chapter 1, verse 16, the gospel is salvation, is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek. In chapter 2, wrath to the Jew first. Not only are you going to be judged along with the Gentiles, you'll be judged first. They're going to get the same judgment as you, but you're going to be judged first. They thought themselves first in salvation and last in judgment. It turns out that they were first in salvation and first in judgment, says Paul. I got a couple of other, what did I do here? Psalm 62, verse 11 and 12. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God and loving kindness is yours, O Lord. For you recompense, you reward, you give back to every man according to his work. There's your impartiality with God, implicit in it. Hosea chapter 12, verse 2. It's all over the place. Just pick them at random. The Lord also has a dispute with Judah. He will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. No Jewish preference. No Jacobian preference. No preference for being of Jacob. That's not going to get you anywhere with me. I do to you what I do to the Gentiles. I repay them according to their deeds. I repay you according to your deeds. So it's harsh. It's a rude away. It's a bucket of cold water, man. You sing yourself this lullaby for centuries. You believed it. Now here comes Paul to point out passages and echo passages that you knew the whole time. And now you got to go back and stare them in the face and realize that they were talking about you. Who did they think that they were talking about? If not, I mean, what improved for Israel after the exile? Did they get better? I think they probably did think they had rediscovered the law and a dedication to it, bless their hearts. But from God's perspective, pre-exile, idolatrous Israel, post-exile, disobedient Israel, it's just one big pot of disobedience. He didn't see any distinction between them. And that's what Paul is saying. Ouch. So in verse 9 there, we get our first use of Jew since 1:16. Right here. And in the same construction of the Jew first and also there it's to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Here it's of genitive. So priority in salvation has its corollary in judgment or condemnation. Jewish presumption led them to believe that they were first in salvation and last in judgment, or not in judgment. They somehow got, I don't know, some kind of free pass. I don't know. I think that the Mosaic law had become its practice had become so corrupted by the first century that and Jesus takes us on all the time with the traditions that he criticizes. Jesus doesn't give them any credit at all for their supposed obedience to the law. Oh, the Pharisees, they love their long prayers in the marketplace. They love to be known that they're fasting, but they're mixing up passages full of dead men's bones. And you're like a tomb that has no marker, that people walk over it and become unclean because they don't know what's there. They're whitewashed tombs, I think is the expression he uses. That's his view. That's how much respect he has for their conception of obedience to the law. None whatsoever. Paul is in that. I think Paul is in that tradition in some sense. We'll read more about that in chapter 9, 10. So he's going to state categorically in chapter 3, verse 2, there is no one who does good, not even one. And that's going to be from Psalm 14:3, but there's lots of other places he could have quoted. There are only two possible outcomes. It's binary. Our modern times hate binary of any kind. They hate no way out. They hate the idea of two doors. But that's the case here. There is either judgment, which has already been passed, and sentence, which has already been handed down, or there is salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. Those are the two paths. For there is no partiality with God, even as there is no partiality in God's favor, which he pours out on Gentiles as well as Jews, so also there is no partiality in God's judgment, condemnation, which he pours out on Jews as well as Gentiles. So God's impartiality extends beyond the frontiers of the physical descendants of Abraham. God plays no favorites, period. And they just missed it. They just missed it. It was right there in their own word. The Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome. One of the things that makes him necessarily who he is, he does not show partiality nor take a bribe. Tough stuff. That's the first 11 verses. You didn't think we were going to get through 11 verses, did you? Neither did I. Anybody want to say anything? It's 10:16. Kind of makes you feel like somebody listening to Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You read this stuff and you just want to run right away and kneel down and pray to receive Christ again, because just in case.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It was intended to. Yeah, it was intended to. Okay, I'll go ahead and shut down now. Thanks for coming. What's that? Okay. See you later, Jocelyn and Dan, if you're still there.
Yeah, we're still are. Thanks, Gary.
Yeah.